chair and anchor this discussion. To my right is my dear old friend from JNU, and I'm meeting her after a long time. She's an associate professor at the School of International Relations. She's my co-chair. We have 4 panelists. And as you know that this morning's discussion is essentially about South-South cooperation and the international architecture associated with it. It is particularly focusing and devoted to the role of ECOSOC and also the development DCF, the Development Cooperation Forum. And the idea being that how has the trajectory of ODA and the development assistance stands transformed today in the twin contextualities of the fact that the global north and south balance is shifting. That is one. And the second fact is that in light of the Agenda 30, Addis Ababa Conference for Financing for Development, the Millennial Development Goals and SDGs which have come about in its wake, now COP21 outcome in its wake, and there's a whole gamut of issue around the subject of development where there are commitments to financing. Now, this deliberation would focus on to the international architecture of it and perhaps the issue where to peg this mechanism, this architecture, and the role of intergovernmental bodies in it, particularly specifically ECOSOC and DCF. Friends, I would say that in the interest of time, a brief announcement that we would perhaps do about my speakers. We have a distinguished panel. I will not introduce them. They will introduce themselves. We could perhaps do about 5 to 8 minutes, depending on the time that they need. And after that, the remainder of the time we will keep for Q&As. So thank you with that. I will give an opportunity to my co-chair if she has anything to say. Add to this.
I will not add anything to this. Good morning to all of you. But because we have a very distinguished panel, I don't think I want to eat into their time at all, and we'd like to begin straight away.
So Naveed is on my left. Naveed Hanif is director with ECOSOC Support and Coordination Office of UNDESA. Over to Naveed.
Thank you so much, Alok, and I'm honored to be here with all of you. And I must say, those who are in this room, you are really diehards. You believe in the institutional architecture that South-South cooperation should have. And I have just struck a deal with Elizabeth. She has given me 2 extra minutes. So I'm so grateful because I need to cover 3 things in my presentation, and Thomas told me that I need to provide a lot of information before they speak. So my intervention may be a little longer than other panelists. Since we are talking about architecture, I want to leave with you some imagery before I come to the points that I want to make. And those 3 parts are not part of this imagery. When you talk of architecture, think of development and look at the last 60 years. Think of what did we have on the scene? And I will give them names that will demonstrate to you what kind of activities they were undertaking. There was called the Aid Company, and these are companies that were running at that time. You had Charity Sisters, you had South-South Cooperation Brothers, and you had Do-Gooders and Sons. These are companies running like kiosks, corner shops, wherever they could find space. I don't want to go into the drivers after the end of the Cold War. Explosion of global consensus in the 1990s. Now you have a mall called Development Cooperation. South-South Cooperation Brothers, the Aid Company, the Charity Sisters, and Do-Gooders, they all moved into that mall. That is the architecture you are dealing with. They have maintained their brands, but the dynamics when you move in a mall, they change. So please keep that imagery in mind when I talk about the evolution, practice leading policy. In the South-South Cooperation's case, it's not the policy leading practice. And what impacts that have had so far, how we need to respond. That's my first part. Second part, I come to the DCF, and third is ECOSOC. And there I will focus the 3 questions which are in this program, which I really find very interesting, but I also see a failure on my part that I have not disseminated the information where ECOSOC is right now. Now, first part is how South-South cooperation has changed in terms of scale and scope. Just start with the Buenos Aires Plan of Action, TCDC, driven by solidarity based on projects. Just zoom to 2005 onwards, especially 2010 onwards. The DCF analysis shows it's $17 billion and increasing. Diversity of activities, practice is far ahead of the policy. It's not solidarity based exclusively anymore. The framework is evolving rapidly in terms of its engagement. Institutions are mushrooming, and yet the conceptual underpinnings have not moved forward. And let me mention to you, because of this lack of progress at the conceptual level, there are 5 functions which need to be performed, and they are undertaken in a piecemeal fashion. And let me list those for you. First and foremost, South-South cooperation means different things to different people. There is no, I won't say agreed, but even a shared understanding of what South-South cooperation stands for. For some it includes trade, commercial investments. For others it's South-South cooperation for development, which we call SSDC. And for others it's based on all non-profit activities. So that's the first function which has to be performed, and it's not being done systematically. Second, the cooperation takes largely at the bilateral level, but we need policies and projects and initiatives that are underpinned by some shared framework. That's the second function which is missing. Third function, South-South cooperation is increasing exponentially. It has to use the multilateral institutions, UN system which is available, but we haven't come around to guide the system. How do you want to use them? System has its own limitations as well, which we acknowledge, but the leadership has to come from South-South cooperation partners. That's the third piece. And the fourth piece, which we discussed in 2013 in New Delhi, you have a North-South narrative based on the aid company's vision. South-South cooperation narrative is again available in pieces, spread all over the place. That's the fourth function, which is also crying for attention. And lastly, sectoral cooperation will increase, and I have seen already in the climate change area is gaining a lot of momentum. So sectoral frameworks are needed. And that brings me to, and these 5 functions, how DCF can help. I will now look at the DCF's work briefly, and then we move to ECOSOC. The development cooperation was created in 2005, and that's why I mentioned the Cold War ends, explosion of consensus, realization that development cooperation has to be discussed at a multilateral setting, impartial, objective, inclusive, and open. That was the rationale, because the discussions on development cooperation were largely aid-based, discussed in DAC. There was no universal platform available, and development cooperation was created for that particular purpose. It has served that function not in its totality, but to the level that it could. I mean, if we are sitting in a cricketing nation, I also come from one. If a team doesn't play up to its potential, you can't blame the stadium. So you can't blame the DCF if it's not doing its function. It's the team that has to come together to play well if you want to use the stadium well. Look, pitch is for both teams. One team can't complain. And because DCF is open to both teams. So both teams should use the pitch properly. But a good one. Now, since the inception of the DCF, which happened in 2008, first DCF was held in 2008, but we started our analytical work, and we have produced studies on South-South cooperation, which have become the most authoritative accounts of South-South cooperation at the global level. Widely used analysis, widely used data. but our sources are spread all over the place. We do not have any source available where we could say, this is where we go for authentic information. And that we have brought to the attention of South cooperation partners many times, that needs to be done. Now, I have to move fast. Let me go to what the DCF is planning to do. And we invite South cooperation partners to share with us even more ideas, what else can be done. And I just want to mention, and that was also because of the New Delhi meeting in 2013, that South cooperation partners came together as a small core group and they started discussing the issues that I have mentioned: framework, measurement, impact, engagement with the partners from the North through a UN forum. All of these things happened because of one meeting in New Delhi 3 years ago. So it's time to move forward, and let me present to you what we are trying to do. For instance, we are now working, and South-South cooperation has so much to offer to capture lessons from the South-South cooperation in various sectors. Infrastructure is topping the list when you go to Africa. But now we understand climate change will also become very significant after the Paris Agreement for South-South cooperation activities. And the DCF will create that space where you come and exchange what you are doing on climate change through South-South cooperation. Institutional innovations in the South are happening much faster than I think they happened in the North. And let me mention to you the Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Development Bank. They have very different governance structures, and their policies in terms of lending differ from the northern institutions. And those should be brought through a multilateral forum like the DCF to the world. And they should be open discussion. Look, South has so much to offer when it comes to innovating institutions. Third, I think where there are no differences of opinion, South-South cooperation, knowingly or unknowingly, going to contribute to the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And DCF is the place where you can come and discuss how you are embracing the new agenda and how your existing work is already contributing to employment generation, to industrialization, to training, to human resource development. Fourth function, which I have mentioned, two things need to happen for development cooperation MAL to function properly. Discourse among South-South cooperation partners and exchanges between South-South cooperation partners and the North-South, the northern partners. The DCF has offered both sides to come together, either at the DCF itself or the variety of symposia that precede the development cooperation, to exchange information. Because the challenge among South-South cooperation partners, they are very diverse and they have different institutional preferences as well. But when they were brought together in the DCF umbrella, the discourse certainly changed. They were willing to listen to each other and come up with common shared ideas that could be taken to the other side. Lastly, and that's where NEST's role is very crucial, cutting edge knowledge that think tanks have in the South. DCF is open to them. They should come and share their analytical work, their conceptual work that they have done, they want to share, both with the South-South cooperation partners and the traditional donors. And we see great value for this kind of exchange of knowledge, going through the UN platform instead of localized shops running it. Because you can't run the South-South cooperation brothers shop anymore unless you engage with other actors on your terms and conditions. But for that you have to have your own clarity. Now, third part of my presentation, which is more of providing you information. Where is ECOSOC? I think it would be unfair to say that ECOSOC has not moved on. Since 2013, tremendous number of changes that the Council has embraced, driven by Rio Plus 20, the 2030 agenda, and demands by member states that ECOSOC should become more dynamic and diverse in terms of its scope of work. ECOSOC used to meet only 4 weeks in a year in July, and then used to go to sleep and wake up again in May and work again in July and go to sleep. That's gone. The council is now looking at partnerships, on discussing how the UN system becomes fit for purpose, on looking at the integration happening at all levels. And then on top of that, council has been given tasks which were denied to the council after the end of conferences in the 90s. ECOSOC got its role after the Monterey Consensus to look at the review. After that, all follow-up activities have been given to the council. Look at the 2005 summit, 2 more minutes. And then look at the Rio outcome, the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action. They have created the High-Level Political Forum under ECOSOC, FFD Forum under ECOSOC, Science and Technology Forum, not under ECOSOC, but run by the President by appointing coordinators. All of these follow-up activities are under ECOSOC. HLPF, FFD Forum were inspired by the Development Cooperation Forum, and that was conveyed by the delegates who decided on these fora. So these opportunities have been created to generate platforms where South-South cooperation partners can come and present their side of the picture. DCF will be the bridge to the FFD Forum, to the High-Level Political Forum, and all the other segments of the Council. DCF will attract the experts on development cooperation and generate ideas which will feed into all these follow-up platforms that look at the 2030 agenda. So ECOSOC is ready, able, willing, and waiting for you to come and use this platform to your advantage. Thank you so much for your time and patience. I'm sorry I exceeded a few minutes. Thanks a lot.
No, it was very useful to for you to having said this discussion, and also emphasis on the shared framework, the North-South narrative. And do we hear that you say that the DCF which came about in the context of the global consensus is finding it difficult to move at the moment with an intended reference that global consensus is weaker today? But that we will discuss with the subsequent speakers. We have Professor Elizabeth from Johannesburg. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. I'd like to potentially pick up on a couple of the points that Navid has raised, and maybe in the interest of sort of the 21st century, I'll say that I'll make my comments in tweets of 140 characters. I think the first and most important point is indeed that the world is now very, very different from when South-South cooperation first started and then was sort of consolidated in Buenos Aires. And I think your analogy of the corner shops is exactly that. Not only has South-South cooperation changed, and the rest of the landscape has changed in terms of whether you're the Sisters of Charity and your good do-gooders and so on. But at the same time, I think our challenges have become so much greater and require so much more cooperation and interdependence. And I'm not sure we say that, but I don't think we actually really do what is required to actually see this come through. And so the question really is, in an environment of scarce resources, and if we talk about one thing that runs as a thread through ECOSOC and DCF, it is the issue of resources, which is linked also to the commitment, and I think again, Navid, you pointed out to that, the commitment of member states. If you want to make something of this, you need to invest. You need to invest time, you need to invest political will, you need to invest resources. But in this environment of scarcity, of financial scarcity, yet at the same time greater need for interdependence, how do we consolidate what we have? Not only, I mean, we're talking here specifically about DCF and ECOSOC, but there are also a number, even within the UN family, a number of bodies that are actually tackling similar issues. And some of them are within the fold, others are partly out of the fold. They draw on different pots of money. They become quite particular about their turfs, and I think that doesn't certainly, in an era where we're trying to create universal frameworks into which we all feed in, I don't think that necessarily helps to advance the objectives. For me, there is a very important dimension to ECOSOC and DCF, which also goes to the heart of what we've been saying is a key principle underlying South-South cooperation. And that's the issue of equality and broad representativity. And if there is one thing that can be said about the institution, is that it has legitimacy. The challenge is now, how do we ensure efficacy and effectiveness? And I cannot overemphasize the role that I think, in the first instance, key developing states who have more resources than others, but then also the broader developing country membership can play in making sure that while we're adjusting the architecture, we are responding in some way to the external requirements. That at the end of the day, you can bring out a brilliant constitution, as we know. If that constitution, if that document is not lived, or if the processes that you establish in the architecture is actually not invested in, we're not really going to go anywhere. The other point I really want to make is that also in this time of great interdependence and significant disorder, whether it's in the economic domain or in the security domain, I think the ability to create bridges is extremely important. And I think we talk about South-South cooperation, and I think South-South cooperation has a unique identity and a unique sort of set of philosophies that I think we all hold dear. And the North has particular responsibilities. But I think the world is also becoming one in which some of these divisions, which were very, very strong and sort of governed the way in which we saw the world 20, 30, 40 years ago, I think are beginning to dissipate from the perspective of the need, the change and the shift in power to a number of emerging economies, but also the nature of the challenge. So when we talk about 3 key developments at a summit level last year, or a high level last year, in terms of financing for development, in terms of climate change, and in terms of the SDGs, those are issues that have to be tackled in a global way, making effective use of the bridges that create platforms and forums for us to exchange views, to come up with common ideas, often common solutions, building on our collective, even though some of it might be different, experiences. And there was one last point I wanted to make, which has now slipped my mind. That's the last point. If there is one sort of enduring lesson that has become that has entered the debate in the last probably 5 or 6 years, is that it's not just about states, but it's also fundamentally about, if we're going to be dealing with these, if we're all going to put our shoulder to the wheel, it's also about bringing in other actors. So it's about bringing in the private sector and so on and so forth. Civil society, we were talking about that yesterday. This kind of forum, and this is maybe about sort of DCF 3.0, is exactly about that kind of engagement in a legitimate, all-inclusive forum. But we're in a time when it has an expanding agenda. We need to ask very serious questions about how we can make sure that it doesn't fail. Because I think it is in the interests of developing economies that doesn't fail. We're fighting the battles at the UN General Assembly. Certainly South Africa in particular wishes to see the General Assembly be more empowered, and I'm sure that your countries too. But here we've worked on modifications to ECOSOC. Let those sort of not simply be token interventions.
Thank you, Professor Elizabeth. I think the discourse is building up nicely from Naveed's development cooperation mall. We have gone to the bridges now. So let's see where this journey takes us from malls and bridges to over to Thomas.
Thank you very much. I wish to make 3 points, but let me start by commending Naveed Hanif as head of the ECOSOC Support Office within the UNDESA, which is the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN headquarters. You have been sort of the mastermind behind the evolution of the DCF and setting it up, opening it up into a multi-stakeholder, more interactive format. And I guess there's no person better qualified to stand for the DCF and provide all the knowledge and competence. So it's a great privilege for us to have you here and get into the conversation. My first point refers to institutional fragmentation at the United Nations system. And now we talk about the headquarters in New York. You made the point, Naveed, and Elizabeth referred to it. We have these new institutions coming up, a high-level political forum, which is now mandated to follow up on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. We have the FFD forum, which is sort of watching over the process, implementing the Monterey Conference Financing for Development. So where does that leave the DCF, Development Cooperation Forum? My perception is, and I may be wrong and I would like to be corrected, that the DCF is being squeezed out. It's losing out in face of these new institutions with all our attention, which is good thing, focused on implementation of the 2030 agenda and what we can bring to the table and our contributions. But here we have the high-level political forum, that's really mandated to have the reports. And they will be coming in, first of all, on a voluntary basis this July. And so DCF is not the focal point. I'm really wondering, maybe you can elaborate further, Naveed, on this. What is the unique selling position of the DCF in the concert of all these old and new institutional arrangements and all the meetings that are sort of competing for political will, time, and resources within the UN system? Second point, and here I'm also very interested to hear your position, Naveed. How would the DCF in the future relate to the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation? I've been to several DCF meetings, and they've been very interesting, illuminating, but of course there the dynamics and the physical arrangements are very limited by the conditions of the UN Secretariat and the formalities of the UN process. It's basically the diplomats, the missions there, and it's all sort of, it's a certain routine. And the facilities, like the last DCF in 2014, there were hardly any side events, there was the reconstruction at the headquarters. So it's the physical space, think of it in practical terms, it's very limited to how other stakeholders can come in and present the work. And that's exactly what made, in my eyes, the 2014 first high-level meeting of the Global Partnership in Mexico so attractive, because it was that marketplace of ideas and actors and everybody could come and interact. So to me, there are some natural or structural complementarities of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation and the DCF. But the challenge is how to bring these together and create synergies and interaction. Third point, you mentioned the core group of SSC partners, initially, or you could call them southern providers or whatever, those countries that get involved now in South-South cooperation. And UNDESA and you personally, you're referring to the 2013 meeting here, that's when it all started. You have played a crucial role in supporting this group. But to my knowledge, as an outside observer, I do not really see it going. I cannot see any visible progress. Also, maybe our colleague, the diplomat from the Foreign Office, MEA here in India, could contribute to that. I'm sorry, but I really do not see any political commitment, any buy-in by the SSC partners into the DCF. 2 years ago, 2014, at the DCF meeting, we talked about a global report on South-South cooperation. The Latin Americans have this wonderful report under CERIP. You would be highly qualified, your secretariat, your section, to provide the work and to coordinate it for a global report. But to my knowledge, and there's no political will by the SSC partners to really strengthen and move forward to buy into the DCF, which I find very unfortunate, and I would love to be corrected if you or other people here in the audience have a different perspective and have different insights into this. A final point here, there's another new important body. It's this body which Paulo Esteves from the BRICS Policy Center in Rio, you're part of this now, and I would love you to come in. And I think your mandate is as an expert group to sort of provide guidance on how the UN system as a whole could best support the implementation and the monitoring and reporting of the 2030 agenda. So Paulo, please come and join our conversation.
Thanks, Thomas, for the compliments to South-South coordination and the political commitment. But I think there's a larger dynamics of the UN that also works into its play. And when you say that there's a routine to the UN, then perhaps the side events also, in the absence of it, they become creative and innovative solutions. But hosting of the side events after a few years, that also falls into a routine. So I think Elizabeth did say somewhere that there's an issue of ultimately resources. At the end of the day, it's going to boil down to resources. And I don't think there would be a situation where you have resources and you have absence of political will. So the bridges, I think, still remains our target in the journey. Over to Professor Wang, who has traveled from China Agriculture University, to her views in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So coming to the role of ECOSOC and the Development Cooperation Forum in implementing South-South cooperation, from my understanding, rediscovering, the role of DCF will have to depend on the significant shift of a DCF agenda from a traditional aid-based development to the more broad-based development. In other words, previous discussions of DCF has been much focusing on donor recipient relationship. So South-South cooperation for many years, of a long time, has been either neglected or regarded as minor complementary to North-South cooperation. Actually, this is largely because of the capacity of South-South cooperation has been much weaker before, but over the last decade there was a dramatic rise of South-South cooperation in both scale and modality, and also the delivery of a new form of partnerships. So in such a context, we should say that South-South cooperation should be considered as not merely complementary to North-South cooperation. Even we can say that it can be to the equal role of North-South cooperation, at least in the terms of different forms of the support. Therefore, Southern partners should be important stakeholders of this DCF. Also, the issue of South-South cooperation should be thoroughly and sufficiently discussed in DCF. And coming to the challenges, before ECOSOC and way forward, I would like to say that although the ECOSOC is a UN agency, its theoretical framework has been to some extent affected by by OECD and by those developed Western countries. So agenda of DCF has been much related to or in line with the agenda of those developed countries. So for a long time, to some extent, the agenda of DCF has neglected the alternative development experience. And the whole mechanism actually has been quite westernized. Actually, we mentioned this yesterday, in the discussion. And also, this westernization also applies to the governance mechanism of these UN agencies. So how to take into account the alternative development approach, the experience, and also, I mean, the new development institutions, I mean, just set up, like AIIB you mentioned already, and NDB, not quite clear so far. So more research or, I mean, understanding insights, analysis of this, and how to address the issue become important in the, I mean, the further work. Okay, so I try to keep my my remarks short. I stop here. Maybe later we can.
Friends, that was excellent. I had targeted 10:15 for the conclusion of our initial presentations. And I think the one thing that comes out clearly is that there is a wide dimension, a spectrum of views within this panel. And thanks, Professor Wang, for your comments, which brings into the light the whole issue of also the agenda setting. And in the somebody, I think Professor Elizabeth spoke about the legitimacy and efficacy also of the institution. And I would add a comment here is that if the agenda and the decisions are universal, then the responsibility is also universal for both the successes and the failures. But perhaps that is a parallel dynamics when the agenda gets set and who takes the blame for the success or for the blame for the failures. But we do have a productive 15 minutes, and perhaps we can eat some of the coffee break for Q&A. So let's go ahead with that. And gentlemen on the first table here. Please. We'll take few questions, bunch
Sure.
it together, and then
Thank you, all the panelists. I had two questions or comments I wanted to raise. Just to, these are mostly directed to my friend Navid. He knows that I like to give him a hard time. Just to elaborate on Elizabeth and Thomas's points, in Delhi 1, I already gave you a hard time on the issues on the critiques on UN bureaucratic inefficiencies and the politics of New York, which colleagues have highlighted. But I want to stress the point that one big challenge of furthering the South-South cooperation agenda is that we have many shops in the UN, all with the same mandate of providing that space. So you made the case for DESA and DCF, but there's the UN Office of South-South Cooperation. There's UNDP, which is supposed to be the focal. The Office of South-South Cooperation is supposed to be the focal point of the whole UN on that. There's UNDP, which is normally the one who has the money. There's UNCTAD, who has been recently given mandate by G77. So many institutions, UN shops, I call them, given similar mandates, and all competing for the same funding of the same member states. So this is a big issue that doesn't help the cause. The second point is the Delhi conference, which the first Delhi one that we referred to, is rightly you said it was the start of the core group that of government bodies that would meet at the UNDCFs. The other process that started at Delhi 1 was the inception of NEST as a think tank, because all these issues of conceptual framework and measurements and impact that you raised, it was an academic issue. So NEST was the parallel process to the core group. And this is a point that my friend Gerardo has also made in his paper. They were supposed to work together.
Excuse me, I mean, would it be possible to phrase your question in one or two sentences?
The question is, why hasn't DESA and UNDCF supported and collaborated in these years with NEST to develop those conceptual frameworks while providing the secretariat support for the core group? It hasn't promoted and has supported instead northern think tanks in these 2 or 3 years that I've seen, where that was an opportunity that DESA lost, I think.
Any other question? Yeah, there is on middle table at the back, a gentleman with. Please do identify yourself for the benefit of the panelists.
Yeah, I'm Gerardo Bracho from Mexico. I'm following up on what Nissan said and also what Thomas said, and I'm referring again to our friend Navid. Rephrasing a bit just to push you a bit more, is that you were saying that in the South-South cooperation tradition we lack a narrative, as the North-South cooperation has a narrative created by the DAC, and in the South-South cooperation tradition we still lack, especially now, a clear narrative of what what South-South cooperation is, how we can evaluate, etc., all these issues. But then the issue is where are we going to construct this narrative? Because of course we don't have a DAC of the South, one thing that we were discussing in Delhi 1. Again, I always thought that the core group that has been mentioned also by Nissan and by Thomas would probably be the place to do this, because the DCF, in contrast, is much broader. The DCF has also the northern partners in, the northern donors in. So we need a place where the South gets together and discuss this narrative. Why, I mean, the core group hasn't really functioned, or what do you think about it? Or where could we construct this? Again, building a bit on what has been said by
So basically proliferation of mechanisms and no narrative.
You know, in cricket, umpires never play. Umpires only watch and give signals. You're asking me to play, I can't play. You are the bowlers and batsmen. I have no role there. I would love to, but I can't. But let's get serious. I think, and Thomas, it's such an honor that I'm sitting next to you. Thomas has been a great supporter of the DCF from the very beginning because he believes in multilateralism. And I want to begin my responses to the importance of multilateralism for both sides. And I must say, I find it very convincing when our Deputy Secretary General started saying, you have heard declarations of independence, but the Agenda 2030 is a declaration of interdependence. 193 countries have accepted our interdependence is so acute, so deep. If we do not adhere to this agenda, we are all in trouble. So when you have this agenda for interdependence, this declaration of interdependence, why do you pretend that you can solve problems by sitting in separate fora? It's not going to happen. South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation, if you continue to sit in your separate forums, you will not solve these problems, and each and every citizen of the world will suffer. And that's where DCF comes in as a platform which we have been urging you to use. And not, let me respond to very specific, very valid and incisive observations. 3 points raised by Thomas. Proliferation, and Nissan also said that. The challenge we are facing right now is, and this is where you should always be careful, don't watch when you're cooking something. Enjoy it when it's on the table, when it is served. We are going through a massive transition, institutional transition at the UN, and agenda transition as well. It will take time, but let me define for you what the different forums will do. And there is some method to this madness. It's not happening out of emotions. There's a logic behind it. If you ask me, and HLPF is the Prime Minister's office, FFD is Finance Minister's office, DCF is Development Cooperation Ministry. Will those ministries cease to exist in your governments? No. HLPF has a very specific role that it has to convene the political leadership to give guidance to the whole system on science and technology, on development cooperation, on financing, on monitoring and review. And they will start performing these roles once you have the agenda. The funny thing about the HLPF was, you always hear the phrase, putting cart before the horse. We had a cart without a horse. No agenda, and you had a forum. The agenda was adopted in September last year. Give them time. They will come up with a program of work. HLPF will assume its role, its space, and other forums will support it. So I don't think, Thomas, DCF will be squeezed. If you read the resolutions and the outcome of the summit, both are calling on the DCF, please give us your analysis, contribution, and perspective on the development cooperation piece. We neither have the expertise, nor analysis, not even the time to focus on it. We rely on you.
And what about the
So
narrative?
yeah, I'm getting there. Let me respond to Thomas. Gerardo is an old friend who has worked on this with me. That's why I said he's asking the empire to play what he should have been playing. Actually, he was part of the core group. Gerardo was sitting in the core group and he knows, but I'll come there. GPEDC. We have been in touch with GPEDC and Thomas, you know the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Their strength lies in national level monitoring, and they complement the work of DCF. And we have invited them many times that whatever you do in terms of reporting, because you have a indicator framework that's available to your members, you can always bring to the UN. UN is open. So come to the DCF with your national level work and share, because DCF does not do national level work. We are based at the policy level, and we discuss conceptual underpinnings of development cooperation on all sides. So there is a very clear complementarity. Now let's come to the future of the core group. Thomas also asked, Gerardo also asked. Let me tell you, it wasn't easy, but it did take off. And I must say, I commend the leadership of those 20 countries who came together. They met in Addis Ababa, then they met in Istanbul. They have met in New York a few times. And of course, the Indian government had leadership role in pushing this idea forward. But the platform was very useful. The ideas were generally agreed that we need to do this. As soon as we moved on to how, that's where we hit a roadblock. And I'm not saying it's a permanent roadblock. Thanks to some members of the group, they are working on it. I think Brazil has come up with a proposal which has been sent to the core group on what are the possibilities exist that group should look at. It's not a group proposal, but one country has gone ahead. And I believe that you keep this platform open, available. The time will come, then they will use it. We cannot push. Member states are sovereign governments. They have their right to decide whenever they wish to decide and use this platform. The stadium is open. Please come and play. It's for you to decide. And Elizabeth says you can design your pitch as well. UN has no conditions on that. Let me come to the narrative. I have to respond to all questions. And let me tell you why the need for... South-South cooperation had a narrative. Let's go back to the Bandung Conference. I trace origins to 1955. Very strong narrative. Non-aligned movement had a narrative. Came to the Buenos Aires Plan of Action. This narrative is not relevant to the current realities. And that's what I'm saying. Practice is going to drive policy. So Gerardo, my point is, and you agree, the narrative has to change. Now you are asking me which platform. I think United Nations is the best place because you have equal voice, one country, one vote. You can bring your principles and negotiate. So that's the place, and the core group could be one platform. You can create some other platform. But please use the multilateral system for creating a narrative which you created in Bandung. But now you have become far more active, powerful. As South-South cooperation partners, your role has changed dramatically. So play it, because now the world is looking towards you. Neeson, I think we have always supported analytical work. Any part of the world can bring it to the DCF, and DCF is an open space. My last point, then I will stop. I don't want to speak too much, but I've been asked to. Thomas, the strength of DCF was we did not let it just stick in New York and let it be the Foreign Office monopoly. The DCF meets 3 times all over the world in 2 years span before it meets in New York. We have been to Uganda, to the Republic of Korea. We're going to Brussels in April. And actors from all walks of life, parliamentarians who are very active, NGOs, think tanks, planning ministries, finance ministries, and foreign offices. They all come together. So we have found a way to avoid and that's a fact of life, the protocols of New York by connecting to the national realities in various settings. We can't undo what is decided by member states in New York in terms of protocol, but we can find a way for you to engage. So this is what we have done through creative means. But if you member states decide to change New York settings, we'll be happy to do that. Thank you.
Now, this is the beauty of a UN bureaucrat. He doesn't play, but he takes the maximum strike. And at the end of it, say, but I will add a point here. When I was at the UN Fifth Committee, this discourse of going out of the UN actually used to come back to New York for the simple reason that going out of New York most of the time would mean going to Geneva or Brussels. And we from the G77 and the NAM community would always say, how many times have you gone to Africa? How many times have you gone to Southeast Asia? So, and there also it would be the proliferation of Marrakesh or Bali, the exotica, and that would represent the global south, which we used to call the metropolitan global south. But we have few questions, gentlemen here, and then the lady over there, and
who start? Okay, okay. Paulo Esteves from the BRICS Policy Center. Thomas, I won't comment on the work of the ITA so far. We just started, and the one thing I have to say is that, as I said in New York, I'm terrified that we have 4 months to do an enormous amount of work. So it's a really a challenge, a good challenge, but it is a challenge. I have 2 comments though. The first one, I'll probably mention that in my presentation during the afternoon. We are all celebrating the SDGs. We are all the Paris Declaration, the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action. Is that? Yeah. We are all celebrating these things, and when I look at these things, I'm able to identify 2 common denominators in all of them. First, private sector. Private sector is now our panacea. It will solve all the problems of the world. It appears in the SDGs, in the SDG 17 in particular. The Paris Declaration is all about market. The market will actually save us all. And the Addis document also bets on the private sector to lead us to prosperity. And the second denominator is actually responsibility. And it's interesting that you mentioned Bandung, Navid, because I do think that we are living today is precisely the end of Bandung. When we have the end of Bandung, we have a redefinition of responsibilities towards global public goods, international development, international security, and so on and so forth. And that's the main challenge that we have ahead of us. What are the responsibilities of emerging powers? What are the responsibilities of northern countries, of the developed countries, and so on and so forth? We don't have the formula anymore. The only thing that we do know now is that CBDR is not working anymore. 92 is far away from us now, and we have to redefine all the responsibilities. And I bet, and this is just a bet, that we don't have any other solution than the multilateral arena. The difference between the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation and the DCF is precisely its universality. And that's why, although I can agree that we have much...
May I interrupt to the question, please?
Okay.
It's a presentation.
No, but it's more like a comment. It's not a question. My feeling is that the core group has a problem now precisely because of the definition of responsibilities of the members of the core group. And that's why it is almost impossible to have a common narrative for all these countries and for South-South cooperation. Sorry about that.
Not at all. We have 2 more questions here, and we have already run at the end of the time, but we can go ahead with that, provided there's general concessions in the room, and we will not have tea and coffee and have questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I keep my question short. So far as my question is to Mr. Hanif, and I think currently under the DCF also other platforms or occasions for the South-South cooperation is mainly on the exchange of experiences. Do you see any more progress going forward? And as I think, now there are also discussions, especially in the next, there's unify the a definition for South-South cooperation, just as you mentioned, or more some like they are a sudden duck. Do you see any prospects in this? So not only the definition, but also statistical and the evaluation scope for South-South cooperation. What's your view on this? Thank you.
There's a gentleman on the second table with the half sleeves, yes.
I will make brief observations. I think it doesn't pertain directly to South-South cooperation. But some of the institutions which South have created, one is BRICS Bank and the other is Asian Infra. You see, basically if you look at the constitution and the way they are going to operate, they are just mimicking the Bretton Woods institutions. Because at the end of the day, any institution has to maintain a gearing ratio of 1:1 and AAA credit rating. The other case is Chiang Mai initiative. It was a great idea, but finally what happened? Because IMF had its say. And third point I would like to make, if any financial crisis or BOP crisis hits any nation today, even IMF is not in a position to bail out countries. One example was about a decade back in case of Korea, and what happened in EU. You see, IMF and even so-called multilateral institutions were just bystanders. These are just three observations.
So who among the panelists would like? Okay, the last question.
Yeah, very brief question. Thank you. Thank you for your words to the whole panel, and particularly to Mr. Navid. I would like to ask you that in this context of the new 2030 agenda, we visualize that there is a multi-stakeholder approach. And you mentioned particularly that the work of ECOSOC used to be linked with governments, but what are you doing to promote this multi-stakeholder approach to bring as well other actors, as Paulo mentioned as well, for example, private sector or civil society, to align this new agenda 2030 to really solve the objectives or the targets that has been raised? Thank you.
So I think over-reliance on the market, to the need of the definitions, to mimicking of the Bretton Woods and the established mechanisms, and lastly, again to Navid.
Shouldn't we let someone else respond? No, I think, let me begin with Paulo's observations. And I just want to let you know what Paulo is referring to. For the first time in 70 years of ECOSOC's history, the Economic and Social Council has been given the authority to look at the future of the development cooperation system. That means funds and programs, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, WHO, ILO, and Paulo is a member of the team. And look at the openness of the UN. It's called the Independent Team of Advisors. They are neither answerable to member states nor to the Secretary General. They have been given full freedom, and they are not attached to any governments. They have come from all over the world, think tanks, academia, former UN staff, and some former government officials, ministers, prime ministers. And they are going to present proposals in 4 months, and they call it the poison chalice. So the openness is there. UN is willing to listen to the outside world when it comes to making itself fit for purpose. Now, I think question, you didn't identify yourself, but it's a very pertinent question. You're asking me whether this, let me put it this way, this has to happen. You can't escape this reality. I can't give you the time frame. When will this happen? But it's an inevitability which you can resist but can't avoid in the end. I would begin with calling it a non-binding shared framework. Don't call it unified framework, a binding framework. Begin with this. Let's sit together around the table, share your perspectives, put it together, and this is non-binding. You can use it if you wish to, but let's begin. And that's where I see the promise of DCF, the core group. And I think, what India launched in 2013, maybe this is the time it will be revived with full force. This meeting may rejuvenate the whole process, conceptually and politically. And I'm hoping that will happen. Now, private sector, and I agree with you, private sector is not a panacea, but look at the Declaration of Interdependence that you have adopted. You could talk about $133 billion of ODA. Let's put South-South cooperation, couple of $200, $300 billion going into concessional finance, and you could talk eradication of poverty. When you talk of the 2030 agenda, you are talking about $75 trillion, which is global GDP. Each and every dollar has to change the way you invest it. And who invests those dollars? The private sector. So it's about behavior modification that we need to, through persuasion, through legislation, through incentives. So it's not that the private sector will solve your problems, but modify the behavior. And let's not forget, and this always reminds me of Yaki Zamni, the Stone Age did not end because they ran out of stones. It ended because you came up with new technologies. So the fossil fuel-based economy has to go. But it will only go if you modify their behavior through incentives. So think of private sector as an instrument, as a vehicle of change, and you have to use it. I understand governments have their limitations, in developing countries more so, but this will eventually happen. Private sector itself is realizing. So I look at it that way. Then let's not forget private sector is for profit and non-profit as well. So don't mix them up. You have now big foundations running billions of dollars budgets. My last observation, mimicking yes and no. And let me put it this way, the voting structure of the new bank doesn't mimic the voting structure of IMF and the bank. So that's a big shift. Allocation of money, money has its own logic. It has to, if AAA rating is needed, they have to follow certain rules. But I still think these institutions are providing alternative models which will eventually grow into mainstream models. Thank you.
No one wonders whether the time has come for a BRICS credit rating agency now, which is doing in-house. But on the behavior part, one wonders at times whether the private sector is inducing greater behavioral shifts in the society or vice versa. This is a long-term call. But I would give an opportunity to other panelists to add their viewpoints. Anyone who wants to say?
Okay, first of all, many thanks to these contributions and the substantive debate. I think we are very close to the challenges that the UN system faces, and we all face, the member states and non-state actors. The point now coming to DCF proper, Navid, that's very important that you mentioned the symposia, the 3 symposia that take place in the time span from one DCF New York meeting to the next. These are very valuable and colorful, active, interactive, lively, multi-stakeholder events. Maybe the question here would be, how can you carry the richness of the and diversity of the actors and of the topics that are generated there back into the DCF meetings proper in New York? You know, just having this report on what happened there doesn't do the job. That maybe is a question that could be a bridge provided. And also I wish to recognize Mr. Leo. He is in the team of Navid, and he's also for years has been very active and one of the shapers and movers behind the scenes. 2 very short points. I think this whole notion of we're in a period of transition is very important. You know, we're sort of a complete rearrangement of the global system, of the challenges, a new recognition of the challenges that we are facing, the profound structural challenges. And here the point that Paula made with the responsibilities is very important. All of us, all countries are challenged with to develop a completely new understanding of responsibilities of governments, of societies, of various stakeholder groups. You refer to the challenge, and I think that's the roadblock there, that the SSC partners, they cannot agree on a new understanding of responsibilities. But let me finish by saying the same thing, or a similar thing is happening in Germany now, you know, with the 2030 agenda. A lot of people still understand it. It's development cooperation. Let's give them some money and they'll do the job. And the big challenge for us is to understand this new responsibility of a universal agenda, that the biggest challenge is domestic transformation at home in Germany.
You want to add some? Elizabeth? Ms. Wang.
I just wanted to thank the government of India for hosting us. We are so grateful that you are now reviving the tradition that you started in 2013. I want to thank for your engagement. Thomas stole my thunder. I wanted to acknowledge Leo, and of course Mr. Wu Hongbo, who is in town, who is leading the DCF team, and my colleagues in New York, especially Ms. Caroline Lombardo. They have done extensive work in producing analysis. And Thomas, what we do is, from the forum, these symposia we organize, we get the analysis and use in the Secretary General's report to enrich the discussion. And we try to get the participants who come to the symposia to take a representative group from each symposium, from Uganda, from Mali. So these are not exotic places, by the way. Go to Mali and you will see. And they come to New York to bring their perspectives to the discussions. And I'm also grateful for your engagement and for the opportunity for us to be with you. And I have to give you an infomercial. Please come to the next ECF and set the agenda. Don't say agenda is being set by someone else. You are the owners, you set the agenda. So Gerardo, please, you should come and use that platform.
Thanks to all the panelists, and may I request my co-chair now for a concluding remark. Thank you.
Well, thank you for letting me come in. It's been really very, very educational for me to sit here and to hear about the UN. Just two very brief points I'd like to end with. One is, if you could allow me to take a critical stand, because as people who teach and study international institutions from the outside, I think we need to be a bit more convinced about the actor stage binary which international organizations often tend to take, that we are the stadium kind of a representation. Because where players want to play is ultimately linked with the strength or weakness of the institution as well. So I think Thomas's point on institutional fragmentation is something which we need to get back to. So at one level, locating the DCF in the context of South-South cooperation, I think we need more sort of analysis on that as well, especially as outsiders. Second very brief point is, of course, we are talking a lot about South-South cooperation, but we are at the same time witnessing a whole lot of transitions, new institutions, etc. And I think there is also cause to go back to the definitional contours of what the South is and how it is changing. There have been enough decades, enough water has flown since the SSC was set up as an institutional mechanism. And now with these new institutions like the AIIB and the BRICS, there are perhaps, a North within a South within the South, the old arguments we saw within the EU structures, for example, etc. So maybe a revisiting and a redefinition of what really the South is and who really is in the South and sits where is something we need to also get back to. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and I revert back to the chair now.
With that, we conclude this morning session. Thank you all very much for making it such a vibrant discussion, and to all the panelists. Thank you.